Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Casey Kochi. I'm the marketing manager at Focal Point. I'm going to serve as the moderator this morning. I know you're all very busy, and we've got a great crowd. I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time to join us. I know, especially with GDPR less than a month away now, there's a lot on everyone's plates. Our team has prepared a presentation for you this morning that I think you'll find really useful. We'll be getting started here in just a few minutes. I just wanted to call our attention to a few housekeeping items before we start. First, you should all have a GoToWebinar dashboard, probably on the right side of your screen. There's an area there to enter questions. Feel free to do so throughout the presentation. We'll be taking about 15 minutes toward the end to do Q&A. The presentation should run about 30 to 40 minutes, followed by the Q&A. If you have specific questions about your GDPR plans of your organization, we're happy to take those offline, and I'm sure Eric and Francesca would be happy to follow up with you separately. All right, so let's get started. Let me introduce today's panelists. First up is Eric Dietrich. Eric is a principal in Focal Point's data privacy practice. He actually helped build Focal Point's privacy practice from the ground up, and today runs the practice nationally alongside our co-panelists. He was one of the earliest voices providing thought leadership on the GDPR transition, helping many Fortune 500 companies build GDPR plans shortly after its passage. He's continued that leadership in the run-up to the enactment date. He's a frequent speaker at industry conferences and events across the country, tackling the biggest topics in privacy, including GDPR. And our second panelist today is Francesca Sanabria. Francesca is a principal at Focal Point and leads the privacy practice alongside Eric. She also leads many of our largest GDPR projects. She's a respected speaker and innovator in the international data privacy regulations. And as a principal in our practice, she's successfully developed and implemented privacy programs for many of Focal Point's largest clients. She's also the IAPP KnowledgeNet chairperson in South Florida and regularly presents at privacy and security conferences around the country. I'd like to thank both Eric and Francesca for being here today and preparing this presentation for us. And with that, I'll pass it to Eric.
Thank you, Casey. Yeah, we look forward to getting into the content here today that we pulled together. We feel it'll hopefully give a little visibility into some of the things you should start thinking about post May 25th. I know there's been a lot of effort for nearly 2 years now, evaluating and enhancing and/or building your privacy functions to align with the GDPR, as well as changes to the operational aspects of your business that may be needed to align. Before we get going, just real quick, for those that aren't as familiar with Focal Point, just wanted to give a quick background on who we are and how we provide various services across industries. So we're a professional services firm focused on risk management. There's a variety of different disciplines that we get involved with. Obviously, as Casey mentioned, myself and Francesca lead up our privacy practice, have a very robust cybersecurity team, as well as other audit compliance services, including training activities that we get involved with. So we pretty much span the gamut as it relates to industries and size and complexity of organizations we get involved with. We get involved with many of the largest organizations out there, as well as even small startups with just 3, 4, 5 people that are just getting things off the ground, but we've got to understand those privacy and/or various regulatory risks that might come into play as they go to launch their product or service. So we think I have a good sense of the implications of privacy risk across a wide range of organizations. Just a little bit more specific on our privacy services, as we've been providing these services for well over 10 years now. Privacy isn't new to Focal Point by any means. The GDPR obviously changes and enhances a lot of those fundamental principles that have been around the globe under various industry and/or regulatory standards. So we felt that we were in a very good position to start helping our clients with the GDPR, and have been doing so really for nearly 2 years now. Time is definitely flying by, and the experiences we've gotten for over 50 plus GDPR type of engagements, both from the readiness assessment to the evaluation to now helping support and implement various compliance functions to support those ongoing compliance activities. So pretty broad range of experiences as well. So for our topics today, there will be 4 main areas that we focus in on, hopefully giving some perspective into what organizations are doing and how they're thinking through those post-May 25th activities, and even still how they might be working to fully align to those GDPR requirements. So one, we'll just retouch on a topic that we've been talking about for quite some time now, is the cross-functional nature of the GDPR and the implications across the organization, not just legal, privacy, or IT, but broad-reaching. And we'll go a little bit more into data subject requests. I know this is a very hot topic, always one that often creates some challenges among organizations on how to deal with those type of requests. I want to give you some visibility into some considerations and what that workflow might look like from an organization standpoint. And then Francesco will guide us through some of the elements of performing system-specific assessments, and then various types of audits that could be thought about going forward on how you could measure and continue to monitor your alignment to either the entirety of the GDPR as it applies to your organization, or to specific elements or disciplines within there, as we often refer to as kind of micro audits targeting very specific areas, maybe like DPIAs or assessments and things like that. Great. So to start things off here, we'll jump into the operational changes under the GDPR. So something we've, as I mentioned, we've been trying to over-communicate to our clients is the broad reach and the ongoing challenges of the GDPR, as it spans so many different operational functions. It spans across those operational functions within your organization. And we might have been, and we probably have been, working very strong on getting those enhancements and getting these program elements stood up at our organization so that we're in a position that we feel comfortable come May 25th. And many of these groups, departments, and functional teams might have been involved to some capacity with helping you or your GDPR readiness team with evaluating and tweaking or enhancing those processes to make sure that you're able to fulfill those obligations under the GDPR. But if we think about all the changes and or the enhancements that have been made to the organization, getting ready, now what does that mean from an ongoing compliance state, and what implications or what obligations and what activities do we need to maintain awareness around, and or make sure that these functional groups that maybe often aren't traditionally involved with other compliance initiatives maintain that awareness and maintain those activities that have been designed to fulfill your obligations for alignment with the GDPR. So the more obvious ones are like privacy and compliance groups, that they will continue to stay obviously well aware of additional guidance, when the time comes, enforcement actions and what that means from an interpretation standpoint, but also on a day-to-day basis, helping manage those data subject requests, the performance or review of DPIAs or PIAs, when data sharing agreements are in place, what does that mean? Are they appropriate, and so forth? So the traditional matters that often fall within privacy or compliance, as well as legal, they'll continue to play that role of providing that regulatory guidance, potentially getting a little bit more involved if they're not involved to a high degree yet around those third-party relationships, data protection amendments, and the contractual obligations that you may have to put on your vendors if they're acting in the capacity of those processors and so forth. So those are the more obvious ones that come into play that we all know there was going to be new compliance obligations established for. But many of these other functions on here, like customer support, where if you have whether it's an email, online chat, and or traditional call center, that they might continue to have implications on your ability to maintain GDPR alignment. And that might be from a data subject request. They might be your front line where requests come in, even though you might have your privacy hotline, your privacy support email address, and so forth published on within your privacy policies. We often know our customers and our clients like to go to the easiest channel, which is often the one that they're most familiar with, and that's customer support. So making sure that we're aware that these groups are going to continue to play a vital role in our ability to align with the GDPR and maintain our alignment and make sure we're meeting our obligations for some of these important areas such as data subject requests and or customer inquiries and or complaints that often could trigger and bubble up into larger issues if not addressed correctly or follow the program that we've designed. Human resources is another area. I know training's a common activity that's occurred across organizations for a lot of different topics, but making sure that awareness around GDPR is maintained and tracked and so forth. And then I think marketing will be another one that I think for traditionally there's, if you're a publicly traded organization from a SOX standpoint, a PCI from a credit card standpoint, a lot of those areas don't necessarily touch on marketing to the high degree that they might be involved with the GDPR and the guidelines that need to be followed around consent management, cookies, and other critical areas. So just things to consider, be aware of, make sure there's the visibility across the organization, the communication channels opened up on how to ensure that these various functional teams and departments understand their obligations from a GDPR post May 25th. So what are some things you could take away and potentially consider, evaluate, maybe just confirm that you already have these in place on ways to ensure that the transition into the ongoing compliance state of the GDPR and that the business operations maintain any functions and or compliance activities is key. So we listed out kind of our top 5 areas here. One being around operational focus training. We've been involved with a great deal on building out general GDPR awareness across all organizations, or at least the departments or groups that'll be involved directly with those EU personal data. But then considering, doing focus training workshops, focus training content being built for those specific functional areas that are going to be involved and have exposure to the organization of ensuring that maintaining their alignment to the GDPR. So very targeted focus training sessions seem to be very effective in bringing that awareness and to those respective groups. The other area, which could also be linked to that focus training, it could be conducted by what we often refer to as privacy champions, not a new concept, but definitely one that has gotten re-energized with the GDPR. And the idea is that there is a privacy subject matter expert, maybe a high degree expert, maybe a light subject matter expert, but a go-to person embedded within each of those functional teams. Maybe it's somebody that wears a dual hat. As we know, often it's challenging to get additional resources from a compliance or privacy or legal embedded into those functional teams. But just training somebody up, being that point person that they could communicate back to the compliance teams, and or the privacy office for questions, for clarity, and for awareness, and then used also as an outbound channel to communicate updates or guidance that's coming from the legal or compliance teams. And they reach out to the privacy champions, and then the champions spread and disseminate that information to the various respective team members. Very effective when you're able to do it, and definitely something that keeps awareness and then also the ongoing alignment to those respective areas. And then going hand in hand with that, having some documentation, often we call it implementation guidelines, playbooks, or other guidelines that are documented and formalized and then are available to those respective teams, really helps provide clarity and gives them comfort that when there is changeover, when people switch departments or leave the organization, that those roles and responsibilities on what compliance activities need to be maintained, what guidelines need to be followed as a respect of all the related areas is a key area that's often very helpful. And it's a little bit down the maturity scale as, training, general awareness, appointment and privacy champions are kind of in the earlier phases of maturing your post May 25th GDPR program, but definitely something that should be considered, and I at least thought maybe we've seen quick one-page cheat sheets almost made for the respective groups to much more robust run books and playbooks for the execution of certain activities. So got scalability and flexibility there, but definitely a valuable tool to consider. The next two areas here, once again, are a little further down the maturity scale as you think through a program maturity. One would be defining some type of key performance indicators for that ongoing operational compliance. So this might be things around, hey, every time we launch a new product, we update our product or service, and it's involved with the aspects where we're collecting personal data, ensuring that those PIAs or DPIAs are being performed in accordance with our internal procedures that we have defined, and then measuring and reporting on that. Another area we see KPIs being built is around our data subject requests that are coming in. How quickly are we responding? What is the frequency of these inbound, and then how are we triaging those? Are they access requests, erasure requests? So a lot of different things can be built to measure kind of the performance of our ongoing operational alignment to those respective areas. And then lastly is building out a program to self-monitor, so some ongoing self-policing, self-check that could be implemented within the organization to help achieve alignment to those areas, and then kind of self-police, the ongoing compliance. Now we'll spend a little bit of time moving into data subject requests, and as many of you may be familiar with the rights that the data subject has, they're pretty vast, pretty broad. Not all new. If you already operated in Europe, there are many countries that have certain rights already, but obviously has been elevated up and has become the broader standard that's going to need to be followed. So the more common ones we see here are and things that are often talked about, right to be informed, right? So that comes back to our notice and making sure the practices and our uses and our obligations that we're agreeing to, we're making sure that those data subjects are informed of them. Right to access, right to erasure seem to be the very hot topic areas. Right to access, giving the ability for an individual to access that information, the personal data that you have on them. Usually that's viewed as a little less challenging than the right to erasure, where the right to erasure under certain obligations, you may be required to erase information, but not in all situations, something to consider, that you might have to erase that personal data that you have about that individual. And we all know from a technical standpoint that creates a lot more challenges when you start removing record sets from databases and so forth. It could create some integrity issues. So definitely see a lot more challenges on the right to erasure. And then the right to portability often is viewed as another kind of linkage to the right to access. Is if you already have a process established to grab that information and put it in a format to give back to the data subject, it's very transferable, and giving it in a format that you could port that over to another organization if that data subject requests so. And then that'll be an area that I think a lot of folks are watching on how that will transpire. And what will be some of the unique challenges that we run into when it comes to portability. And then some of these other ones are usually other areas that we need to think about and as we build out our program. So what we wanted to do now is thinking about all the different rights that an individual has. What are some of the things we need to think through and to fully understand what we need to do to evaluate that. And what we like to talk about is that design document. This might be something you've done already, but if you haven't, this is an area that could really help with the ongoing maintenance of the program. So there are some different areas that you could get that you need to think through, and think of this design document, and we'll show you some samples here about the way that you could think about each request as a unique use case. So what we mean by that is that an employee might submit a request for a certain type of information, and then what would be all the parameters that we need to think through on, are we going to have to accept that? Which systems might we have to go and pull that information from? Who's going to go and pull that information? And so forth. So what we have here is just a list of a few different areas that will be very important for you to kind of understand at your organization. So for instance, identify those different data subject types that apply to your organization. So some examples we have here are employee, job candidates, customers, even clients. And often, if you're in the healthcare space, maybe you'll have physician details, maybe you'll have patient details, right? So all the data subjects that are unique for your organization. And a lot of this could come from your record of processing. So if you're already established what's in scope from a GDPR perspective, what business activities are in scope, then this could be, you could leverage that information to transpire it into, okay, what are the different scenarios that we need to think through, knowing that we're not going to think through every scenario. That's not practical, but what are the most common requests that we foresee coming, and how are we going to actually execute those requests? So think of this as your kind of design document, as I mentioned, where it helps kind of go through that process. And including the kind of the other areas that we'll touch on, the legal basis, the systems, the types of requests, as well as the specific data elements that are going to be impacted. So give you a little bit more visual on what that might look like. This is a very simple template, but think about each row as a particular use case, as we like to refer to it as. So as you can see in this one row, we could say, okay, the data subject type, and we just like to list out a few different ones, would be an employee asking for, and their type of request is access, and this information, and this one is for simple terms, we're just using employee benefit details, that they, and then some more informational, that it's just our corporate entity, we're acting in the capacity of a data controller because we own the relationship with the employee, and in this sample, we're saying it's a performance of a contract because this individual is under an employment agreement. And then here's where we start to think about some of the areas that we need to consider. So are we going to accept this, or are we going to be able to reject it based on a legal basis for rejecting that request? So in this case, we just wanted to give two simple ones. So this one's an accept, so that we don't have to document the legal basis for rejecting. But if we were to reject, like an erasure, there's often reasons why you could reject removing some employee data for conflicting regulatory requirements. And just to continue that tabular format, so continuing these rows along, just different columns that are being considered here, is you could see that we then jump into, okay, so for the one that we're going to accept, the access, where are we going to go and grab that information? So those data elements that we're going to grab, so this could be pretty specific or high-level categories. The impacted systems that we would want to go through, whether they're third-party managed, because that's going to come into play when we got to execute the request. We got to know how we're going to go and actually pull that information, and then some additional details to help fulfill and execute that request. So hopefully that gives you a little bit visibility into the design aspect of the document. And then, so then when you pass that point, then you can say, okay, we can anticipate for the large majority on the type of request, how we'll execute it. If we are going to reject it, why are we going to be able to reject it? So we have our kind of playbook. But now what you need to think about is from an execution standpoint and the workflow of the program. And we just wanted to highlight a few key areas here that are very important as you're building the program, and then how you're maintaining it on a go-forward basis. So just some sanity checks, we like to call them, as you might be well underway, but as you get ready for that May 25th deadline, and knowing requests might have already started flowing in, but really starting to flow in May 26th, are we going to be able to handle those requests? So are we going to be able to, do we have the ownership of this program? Do we have a process established to triage and review those requests as they come in? Do we know what channels they're coming in? Have we designated email addresses, phone numbers? Have we trained our forward-facing our employees on how to direct those inbound channels? So that's kind of the triage, the ownership aspect. But then how are we going to authenticate? This is a very interesting conversations that we have with our clients in figuring out, okay, what works best for you, and what's going to be a way that we could authenticate that data subject is somebody who they claim they're going to be. Because there's a broad speculation that there will be some attempted identity theft or manipulation of this data subject rights process to gain access to information, maybe unauthorized access to information. So making sure that those authentication procedures are in place are very important. And then some of the others, making sure there's a repository, whether it's a simple file share or a much more complicated automated solution that maybe you're working on building or purchasing. Making sure that there are templates that could be used for initial response, saying, hey, we got your data subject rights request, and here is, we're working on it, and we'll get back to you within 1 month timeline. Or, hey, we're rejecting it because of A, B, and C. Here's that template. So making sure that those are all fine-tuned and ready to go. And then obviously you continue to maintain and update those as you start to work through this process and so forth. And then timelines. Within your workflow, it'll be very critical that timelines are established to ensure you're maintaining alignment with the kind of the 30 or 60 or really the month and 2 month windows that you have to respond to certain requests. And then more importantly, a lot of people ask on what's the best way to manage this workflow. And it really depends on how many data subject rights do you anticipate? Where do you envision this being? And how and what kind of sophistication do you want to build in from an automation standpoint to minimize the manual effort? So there's nothing that dictates how you should design it other than the anticipated number, the resourcing capacity, and obviously budget to develop some of those solutions. So with that, I'll be passing it off to Francesca right now, who'll talk a little bit more about performing system-specific assessments.
Thank you, Eric. So another area that we anticipate certain operational changes from a GDPR perspective, and is aligning with one of the sub-articles of Article 32, around security of processing, which actually requires the implementation of a process for organizations to regularly test, assess, and evaluate the effectiveness of those measures, technical organizational measures that you have to ensure the security of the processing, right? So as part of the records processing activities, and hopefully organizations have already identified in the key systems and environments and technical environments where that personal data resides, and where personal data is processed, accessed, stored, and so forth. So how we're going to be able to demonstrate that we are making sure not only that we have policies and procedures in place around information security to make sure that that information is secure, but also how we're going to demonstrate that we can actually have comfort that those measures and controls are actually continue to operate. So one way, and I want to give you guys some visibility, is in how do we actually demonstrate what type of program do we have to build, and how do we go about it from an approach and methodology perspective. So one possible solution is, align some of the key GDPR article applicable system requirements that in GDPR topics to some of the framework around ISO or NIST that can actually help you map those GDPR topics. So, for example, if you have aligned your information security policies to a standard out of ISO, and many organizations are thinking of ISO since it's an international standard, and if you already have your policies mapped to that, it's actually a great story and consistent approach to tell where you say, okay, my policies are aligned to ISO, and then those are my policies and control statements are aligned to that, or ISO 27102, and then so the way I'm going to evaluate those measures is to identify key controls that I can identify for the systems are in scope for GDPR, right? And assess those going forward. So here you can see, for example, that we have different GDPR topics that are applicable for systems like pseudonymization and encryption, and then controls around confidentiality, availability, resilience, and the ability to restore. So you can see some examples of some illustrative controls in the ISO that relate to that, like our logging, our own backup, around security in the development process, cryptographic controls. So this could be the beginning of the framework that you're building to identify those controls. So one way is to map these GDPR topics and ISO subcategories and controls to your own policy statements and control statements, and serve that as the basis to identify key areas that you want to make sure that are in place for the systems are in scope for GDPR. So as we think about the framework and then think about, okay, how do we build this program? And so the approach and methodology you're gonna have to start and think, okay, who's gonna own this program, right? So depending on the size of the organization, you may IT compliance either on a global basis, or if you have different business units, maybe a combination of your global IT compliance versus your specific regional or brand or BU specific compliance departments. They'll definitely play a key role, and the reason why is like if you have that, they already used to doing that for other compliance requirements, right? Being PCI, being SOX. If they're if you're a public company, you're already subject to that, and they play a role in owning those controls and helping with that assessment. But also the privacy office needs to play a key role as well as this is going to be a component of GDPR and your privacy program overall. And so a lot of companies are considering, at least in the beginning, like a collaborative effort in this regard to make sure that you're defining those roles. And then from a control ownership, that's going to be important. So as you haven't defined these policy statements and start defining controls that you want to make sure that you apply for each system that is in scope for GDPR, you want to make sure that you give some accountability for those IT system owners, or if it's a system that is actually sits in the business, like in the HR, we have a lot of those. They need to make sure that they apply that model. So that has become following that model has become to be a good venue for defining that ownership from a controls perspective. So once we define the roles, then we're going to have to think about, all right, so does that mean that do I have to test all those controls that I have defined for all the systems? I have, and as you know, the GDPR brought such a big scope that, how do I make this manageable? Because if I have 40, 50 systems or 200 systems to test every year, and plus all the other niches that I have going on, how am I going to make this happen, right? Does the GDPR say that I have to test all of them and so forth? And of course it doesn't, right? It's definitely a very risk-based approach, but there has to be some rationale and then thought process of what your approach means. So one of the key questions perhaps you can start is, okay, is this in scope GDPR system? Is it already in scope for other compliance initiatives like PCI or SOX? So if you already have that going on, and as we talk about that mapping, you can add a mapping of those GDPR and ISO and PCI and SOX controls to each other, and you're probably going to get there, and there may not be anything extra that you may need to do. If it's only SOX, perhaps you may need to add the encryption requirement to some of those, since that is not typical like SOX control. But you can doing that and do the mapping, identify just less than a handful of controls that you may need to test for that system, because it already gets evaluated every year for other compliance requirements. Another consideration is it a third party or internal system? And the reason why that is important is because by principle, right, if you have a third-party system, a lot of these controls where you may not have access to the code, or you may not have control over in the infrastructure of that system because it's a SaaS solution and so forth, some of those controls may be managed by the third party. So in that case, we can point to that and just focus on the controls that sit on the organizations. For example, in a SaaS solution, you may not have access to the code, but controls around access where for the users that sit in the organization that have access to it, you definitely need to evaluate those and make sure that these business system owners or IT system owners understand that, and that's something that needs to be monitored and it has to go through your regular approval process and review process. And the other hand, too, if you have a vendor risk management program where not only you're doing due diligence with the third parties, but also you have a continuous monitoring program, which is another big topic of the GDPR. How are you going to demonstrate that you're evaluating your third parties, which is your processors and sub-processors, if you're a controller and so forth? And you can point to that, right? You can say, hey, this system is a third-party system, so as part of this program, we're focusing on the controls that the organization is responsible for, but for the other controls, we are pointing out to the monitoring process that we're doing as part of the other program that we have built around vendor risk management. So definitely so that keeps narrowing the amount of work that we may need to do as part of this program. And then also to put that risk-based approach too, then you may have defined, if you have a large number of systems in scope for GDPR, you may have already defined like a privacy risk score, some privacy indicator for you to, where you were able to prioritize certain systems, right, versus other ones, right, with they present like a higher or lower like privacy risks. So you could apply an approach where the ones with a higher risk, and because they have a more data for the and volume and types of data, the sensitivity of the data, and so forth, compared to other ones, which is some of the factors that can help you calculate that score. You're gonna those you're gonna test more frequently, or at least on an annual basis. You're gonna do some independent validation module, right? Mode where you actually are using IT compliance or whoever you're using to do the assessment to actually validate that, versus for the ones that are lower risk, you can do a combination of the self-assessment where these IT system owners and business owners, they are certifying that those controls are in place for that system, and do a variation of that, right, to make this more manageable and to start also educating owners of the systems understand the importance of applying these privacy and security controls across these systems that perhaps were not evaluated in the past. So now that we've thought about the roles in the system, so you understand. As in any other compliance effort, if you're doing assessments, you're going to have results. You possibly, and we expect that a lot in the first year for sure, you're going to have certain systems that are not going to be able to align with all the security requirements and controls that you expect for, since there's still remediation going on that you studying the readiness and so forth. So you're going to have results that you're going to have to analyze and risk assess and be able to handle and be able to demonstrate, because now you know that there's some weaknesses in your environment that you need to demonstrate that you are actually addressing them. So so one way, is to make sure that in the same way you are maybe analyzing results from your PCI environments, from internal audits, from your external audits. So the mechanisms that you already have in place to report and analyze that, these type of issues are very related to that, right? And they're very similar. So they should go into the same pool of processes that you have to analyze, and from a reporting mechanisms as well, right? You want to make sure that the decision makers and senior management and compliance departments and who are in the decision makers, they can help make cost-benefit decisions and risk acceptance decisions to see if we need to then implement new technologies or add additional resources to be able to remediate these findings are informed, right? So that's definitely going to be very important. And if you already have a GRC program, GRC tools, these findings should go there like any other one. So again, nothing too significant there. It's just more, and we need to be cognizant that this is a broader scope. We still want to be able to demonstrate that we're tracking and resolving and have remediation plans, because the worst will be to now know and have lingering issues for years, and then when knock on wood somebody comes and to ask how you're addressing these findings, that you don't have a good story to tell. And something that we can lose oversight of, and the data protection officer under the GDPR, one of his roles is to perform and provide oversight over compliance and audits and assessments. So this is one mechanism that the DPO can have visibility into any critical findings and being part of that group of parties that are going to be informed or significant findings. So the DPO will play a role depending on how you have been decided to have for the need of a DPO and how you have defined his role. This will be one way for the DPO function to demonstrate that they have visibility and they're providing oversight over us and the assessments and the continuous operation of the GDPR program. So hopefully that gave you guys some visibility onto how you can start thinking about, as you're maturing the security of processing requirements of Article 32 under GDPR, and you're aligning with this specific one, 32.1d, which talks about monitoring and evaluating those technical measures throughout. And all right, so one last piece that we wanted to talk about today with you guys is around conducting audits for GDPR compliance. So many of you, as part of the readiness, probably had an internal audit on your back, perhaps, and trying to wait for you guys and organizations to be ready, and internal audit playing a role from advisory, but at some point, right, organizations going to have to start to demonstrate that how ready they are, and they may be able to choose to use an internal audit function, and they may be considering including that already, and they may have a year-end audit plan for this, or for late this year or sometime next year. But I think it's something that's very important, since it is a new regulation and for everybody, and then there's a lot of education across departments that Eric was alluding in the beginning, around with the privacy office and IT compliance and the DPO and so forth. We really think that there's going to have to be some collaboration, where if you have a very independent, separate internal department, there might be some collaboration this first year to make sure that if internal departments do not have the skills on this, or they need the insight from the privacy and legal folks and so forth, as these audit programs are built and so forth, at the end, the intent is to make sure that we're helping the organization mature the environments and help operationalize the GDPR program. So definitely something to consider, and not be that strict with that separation of roles. So there are different ways how you can think about planning for your GDPR program and your audits in particular. So one way is doing like a full GDPR audit, right? And that includes not only your policies and procedures, going through all the articles and then, but also help seeing how those policies and procedures have been implemented. So, and that perhaps the first year, depending on how ready you think your organization is, might be too much, since you might not be there yet. So perhaps our organizations are starting with a more just audit focus on the policy and procedures, and to expand on that, right? We want to make sure at a minimum, right, that you are able to demonstrate the potential work products that we think or regulatory agencies and entities may actually ask for organization to provide, such as your records of processing, which is, again, it helps you demonstrate that you got a good grasp about where that personal data is, for what purpose, and the legal basis, and so forth. So that's definitely a very, very likely document to be requested. And then all the different policy and procedures and the security and privacy side that you had to enhance and develop, and including some key components of those, such as the DPIA, which is definitely a key requirement of GDPR, and it helps you demonstrate that you are assessing high risk processes where they represent a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individuals, and it helps you demonstrate that you are evaluating and that throughout changes in your organization and your processes. And of course, a third one would be, I think regulators understand that many organizations, in majority, it's impossible to believe that they're going to be fully compliant, right? So having visibility, being able to provide, right, a remediation plan and that roadmap that you have been working on, right, as part of your readiness, and being able to demonstrate where you are and where you're doing, and so that's one of the other artifacts that perhaps audit can make sure that they validate and as part of that policies and procedures and readiness audit. So that's one approach, and then another way is, okay, what if we just do some more specific, more like what we call like a micro audit? Like you focus on a specific area to that. Imagine that you management said, I think we have started to operate this, and we think that we have implemented a process, so it's ready to be, kind of validated to see if these ad hoc processes, right, that are event driven, are actually following the policies and procedures that we have designed. So, and for example, in the data subject request side, right, as Eric was alluding, imagine going through different use cases that actually happen with real events and see how they were handled, to see if they follow that workflow that was designed, if you follow from a timeliness perspective, if you follow the different legal basis for accepting or rejecting. So this is like a typical sample test that can be done in making sure not only that you follow the process, but actually if it was an erasure request, you go and ask for evidence that the information get actually erased from the system. So you have to get requests from IT, from legal, from those ticketing systems or manual trackers that you may have decided to be implemented. So that's a very good one that can be designed for that. The other one is the PIA and DPIA, right? So you can get a sense of doing internal audit or the compliance. You may have an idea of key changes happening in the organization. So seeing how they may have been going through a PIA and DPIA and being able to demonstrate that they follow that according to the GDPR requirements. And then retention, we know that this is one that organizations are putting as a lower priority in the remediation data, but at some point we're going to have to demonstrate not only that there's a policy in place across for a corporate perspective, but how each business unit and for the GDPR and scope systems, we may already be able to demonstrate that those retention periods were configured correctly and so forth. So that's another area where we could we can do macro audits and test samples of systems or processes. And then consent, of course, as you guys know, consent is extremely important. And this is also very customer facing. This is one of the areas that can, similar to data subject request, can get us in trouble. So this is one area that we want to make sure that we're able to demonstrate by doing tests, and we're trying to call the call center or submit for where I want to withdraw my consent, right? I think that I have provided before, seeing how that process it gets followed across all the systems, and that you don't keep receiving emails, or if you change your privacy preferences, and that can be done with real test scenarios trying to think of all the different use cases and test for those. And then breach response, as you guys know, the timeliness will be important, and how well this may have been operationalized through tabletop exercises, and seeing how we may be being aligned, depending if you're a processor or controller, with 72-hour requirement, and being able to respond to that. And then last but not least, definitely the vendor risk management program, right? So how we, for a sample of vendors, there are new vendors, and for vendors that we know are very important from a GDPR perspective, that is following the due diligence. Are we able to demonstrate that we have done due diligence in the beginning? Are we able to demonstrate that we are assessing them continuously and appropriately? So hopefully this gave you guys some visibility and ideas as you guys are trying to validate the operationalization of many of these operational changes that Eric was alluding on at the beginning, and how then we can start thinking about how we're going to assess and do audits. And again, as I said, not only think that this is a role of audit, I think a lot of the departments involved and compliance organizations need to make sure that they play a role in this, since it's in the best interest of everybody to make sure that these operational changes are working correctly. All right.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. We've had a few questions that have already come in that we'll start with, but if there's anyone else out there that has questions they'd like to ask Eric and Francesca, please do submit those now into your GoToWebinar dashboard. I think the first question actually I'll take, and that is, will the recorded version of the presentation be shared afterwards? And that answer is yes, of course. We'll send out an email either this afternoon or early tomorrow morning with a link to the recorded version of this webinar that you can forward on to others in your organization. So now to the good questions. How do the GDPR requirements differ for data processors versus data controllers, particularly as it relates to general consent or lawful basis for obtaining and processing personal data?
Casey, I'll take that one. That one's a pretty broad question, but I think in general, what everyone's got to remember is the data controller is the one that has the obligations directly with the data subject, and then traditionally, the data processor's role and how they're using that information, how they're processing it, is very much dictated through the contractual agreement that's in place between the data controller and the data processor. Hence, the important focus of controllers really making sure that those contracts that they have with all their processors are accurate, up to date, have the data protection amendments, as well as dictate the use cases of the information and the roles and responsibilities of that processor. So often the good news is that the basis for the collection is often left up to the data controller, as they're the ones that have that relationship with the data subject. There are times where you run into dual controllers or relationships where there's kind of both are data controllers and so forth, where it gets a lot more complicated. But in general, I think the data processors' responsibilities and obligations on what they're doing and how they're doing it, and what they're allowed to do, is dictated through that agreement.
Great. The next question is a bit of a deeper dive into that same topic. So relating to how marketers understand consent and lawful basis for prospects. So I'll read the question here. In B2B marketing, the source of information, like business emails, et cetera, are obtained from public sources such as LinkedIn or Hoover's, what are the consent obligations of the data processor that is using that information for marketing?
Sure. So I think there's a few things that we could talk about in that question. So the first would be using publicly available sources with contact details that are publicly available, and then what's our obligations from a consent. Now, while there's no absolute guidance on this, I think there is a notion that would still be an acceptable means to reaching out to individuals if that information is available publicly. However, it would be on the obligation of the organization performing that marketing to ensure that they are, upon the initial contact with that individual, they're asking for kind of consent to continue either receiving communications and/or establishing that relationship. So usually there's the thought that you could have that initial contact and potentially one follow-up, and that's debatable. But then there would need to be some consent to continue those marketing communications with those individuals post those initial relationship that's being established. So I think that's an area that you got to consider. The goal of the GDPR is not to stop all marketing activities by any means. I know it feels like that for a lot of marketing teams, but just making sure that that you're being transparent, you're providing notice, and that you are following those data subject rights, including getting the explicit consent to continue those communications.
All right, and the final question we have here, unless any others come in, is in regards to legitimate interests. Legitimate interest as a method for lawful basis is somewhat subjective. Can you address that category and how it can be used as a lawful basis justification and pros and cons of that approach?
I'll take a stab at that one as well, and then Francesca, if you got any additional comments. And you're right, there is a lot of subjectivity to the legitimate interest category for using that as your legal basis for the data processing. I think there is a lot of discussion that this is going to be the most widely used term for that data processing, and it'll be one that I think we'll get clarity on relatively quick during enforcement, during opportunities for additional discussions with data protection authorities across Europe, as I'm sure there'll be some abuse, we'll call it, of that basis to process and collect information. So I think there needs to be a reasonability test that's performed to ensure that it's kind of falling within the confines of the definition of legitimate interest, but there's not going to be a black and white for sure. So I think that's kind of what we would say, right? At this point in time, but it is one that is widely being used.
Excellent. Well, looks right as I was about to say. That last question, another one popped up. All right, Google is claiming the role of data controller rather than processor in regard to publishers, putting them in a difficult situation because Google won't reveal how they're using data. They're requiring publishers to pass on in order to place ads. Any thoughts on how publishers could comply?
I think there would need to. That's a pretty specific question, and I think we would need to evaluate that a little bit more, and be happy to have a conversation, off of the webinar to further understand those specific, obligations and what that might mean for those advertisers.
Great. Well, that should be the final question for today's webinar. I want to thank everybody for attending. If you need more information, we'll be sending around the recorded version, and I'll include contact information in there if you need to reach out to Eric or Francesca for further clarifications. You can always find more information at focalpoint.com, or you can email us at info@focal-point.com. Thank you.